Welcome back, everyone. This is What on Earth is Happening. I'm your host, Mark Passio. Today on the show, we have a very, very special guest, Mr. Larken Rose of LarkenRose.com. I'm going to read for you his short bio, and then we'll jump right into it with Larken Rose. Larken Rose is a self-professed, quote, enemy of the state, end quote, and the author of 4 books, 2 of which he wrote while being held as a political prisoner for a year by the gang that calls itself the United States government. He has also written countless articles and done dozens of radio interviews advocating the concepts of self-ownership and a voluntary society. For the sake of full disclosure, Mr. Rose confesses that he is a former member of the cult of statism, and for years, along with everyone else he knew, devoutly prayed at the altar of the mythical deity known as government. Having eventually escaped the clutches of that cult, he now devotes much of his time trying to deprogram as many others as he can so that they too may reclaim ownership of themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to What on Earth is Happening, Mr. Larken Rose. Larken, it's a pleasure to have you here today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Mark.
Great. So I figured we could start off by having you tell the audience a little bit about your background and what basically guided you to some of these concepts and topics that you speak about now.
Well, I was raised basically sort of libertarian-leaning, conservative, Republican-ish. Not just my parents, but most of the town I grew up in. And I can't really point to one source that nudged me in the direction I am now. My wife Tessa and I sort of corrupted each other along the way until we both ended up here. But for me, it was really a matter of getting rid of inconsistencies in my own position. Like, I love to argue and I love to debate and I like to win because it's no fun debating and losing. And when I notice problems in my own argument, I have to back up and say, okay, something's wrong there. That didn't make sense. Like, I'm arguing for constitutional government or limited government or whatever, and I get stuck where my own argument sounds stupid to me, and I back up and say, all right, that didn't work. There's something wrong. What do I have to change? Not just about the argument, but about what I actually think. Because if what I think is inconsistent with itself, it's wrong. You can't be inconsistent with yourself and still be right. You can be consistently wrong, but you can't be inconsistently right. So basically, I whittled down more and more about the religion known as government and statism, and found, I started from the position, well, it should only have a military, it should only do the police, it should only protect us, and yeah, it has to do taxes for those necessary things. A position that millions of people still believe and still are in. But when it came down to thinking about the underlying principles, I would come across, wait a minute, if I want this thing to protect us, how does that jive with assuming it has the right to extort people and tell them you have to pay for our quote-unquote protection? And so I started saying, well, taxation should be voluntary. And I realized, well, if it's voluntary, it's not taxation. And so just bit by bit, the whole illusion of authority in government sort of fell apart. And this was this was having debates with people online and in person and reading things. And a lot of it was just having discussions with my wife, Tessa, like I said. And we each corrupted the other one into giving up statism. I'm not sure who won the race, but we both sort of talked about things back and forth until we both ended up realizing there can't be legitimate government. There can't be a ruling class that has the right to be there. And unlike most anarchists or voluntarists or whatever term is less scary for people, I didn't come to the conclusion that we could either have government or we could have no government, and no government would be better. like on a practical basis, I know a lot of people do. I got there by realizing there can't be government. There can't be legitimate authority. There can't be a right to rule. No political ritual or document or any of the rest of that can make one person have the right to rule somebody else. And if it's impossible, if it can't exist, arguing about whether we should have it makes as much sense as arguing about whether we should have Christmas with Santa Claus or without Santa Claus. When you realize there isn't one, that question is sort of, well, duh, there isn't one. The only question after that is, do you want to live your life based on a lie, imagining something that isn't there, or do you want people's perceptions and behaviors to be based on reality? And really, that's all I advocate, is that people act, view the world and act accordingly based on reality, not based on the mythology we were all taught, having to do with authority and government and law and crime and all the terms that basically imply that we need a ruling class and that there can be a ruling class that's legitimate, and that if we don't all bow to this superhuman thing that keeps us civilized, it would be chaos and mayhem. So
that's one of people's most overarching fears, of the reason that they give for the necessity for government is that if there wasn't any, there would be chaos, and the underlying emotion that drives that position is fear.
Absolutely. And I like to point out that fear, which, and I had it for years and years, and no, we can't have none, we have to have some. It actually, it shows that the belief in government is a blind faith issue. It's not about rational thought and figuring out how to make things work, because the logic of it just on its face is really bizarre. The logic goes like this. Now, people don't say it this way, but this is what they mean. Human beings are so unpredictable and sometimes immoral, sometimes negligent, sometimes nasty, that we have to take some of those nasty, negligent, vicious human beings and give them the power to control the rest of us by violence. As if that's a rational solution, whether we're all nice or all nasty or something in between. But the only reason anybody would ever suggest such a thing, and I often make a comparison that if you're getting attacked by a swarm of killer bees, the solution is not to try to create an authoritarian hierarchy among the bees to have some of them tell the other ones not to sting you. However nasty we are, or however nice we are, taking some of us and giving them permission to dominate everybody else is a really bad idea. And the only reason that isn't obvious to everybody is people are taught to view government as a superhuman entity.
One which we voluntarily choose to abdicate our personal responsibility to. Larken, hold it right there. This is absolutely great. We'll continue right on the other side of this break. Don't go anywhere, ladies and gentlemen. You're listening to What on Earth is Happening here on the Oracle Broadcasting Network.
Constitution like the...
We're back, folks. Larken Rose today on What on Earth is Happening. Let's jump right back into it with Larken. Larken was explaining to us that he had arrived at his current position that all statism, the belief in authority, is a cultish belief system because he stripped away all of those veils that stand between our perception and the truth. And he was able to do something that few people are able to do, seem to be able to do. He was able to set his own ego aside and reevaluate his belief structure. And to be able to say, I was wrong, and then change your mind is one of the most powerful internal works that anyone can ever perform upon themselves. So, Larken, go back to what you had been talking about before about the idea of handing over authority to people who are basically, fundamentally not perfect in their own right and don't really have any kind of a perfected morality is a flawed idea to begin with.
Right, right. The notion that, mankind is so unpredictable and nasty and dangerous that we need a government. The trouble is, what's the government made of? Well, some of those dangerous, nasty people, in fact, not the best of them, but the worst of them. And most people agree, yeah, politicians are mostly liars and crooks. But they still fall for the notion that for us imperfect human beings, and we are, for us imperfect human beings to get along, we have to find some of the most imperfect and give them permission to violently dominate the rest of us, as if that's going to improve things.
And there are some of the lowest consciousness among us. I would say it goes so far as to the fact that they really are psychopathic, and they are naturally drawn and gravitate to that position because of their psychopathic nature or psychopathic tendencies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you run a ad in a newspaper saying help wanted, come dominate your fellow man and tell him what to do and hurt him if he disobeys, who do you think is going to call for the job? It isn't going to be all the nice people. It's going to be the people who are narcissistic and love to dominate others, which is about as evil as you can get. And that's the nature of the job. The idea, and for ages I fell for the notion that, well, government can be good. We got to watch out for the corruption and bad people getting into power. But it can be good. And no, it can't. It can't ever be good because all it does is threaten people with violence. That's all the law is. And they have all the flowery rhetoric and propaganda that we're taught to try to make it look like something else. But everybody knows that when when the control freaks issue a law, they're saying you have to do this or you're not allowed to do this. And if you disobey, we hurt you. I mean, everybody knows that's the underlying reality of what happens, but people don't talk about it like that. Because if they did, it would sound, basically, if they just stated reality bluntly, statism sounds as insane as it is. Saying we need some people to have the right to initiate violence against innocent people. Otherwise, some bad people might initiate violence against innocent people.
And this is what has been called the semblance of good, which is something that I wanted you to touch upon. People who think this is the right idea only because they fear the scenario that might, not definitely will, but in their mind might come about if this artificial control structure were not in place. And thus they think that this is choosing the lesser of evils or choosing what they, in their perception, believe to be good. Some philosophers have termed this the semblance of good, and almost invariably it leads us down a primrose path that leads to nothing but chaos. Can you touch upon that idea?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I see good news and bad news here. To me, statism is a superstition that people are programmed into. But their own moral code, at least basically, is usually pretty good. They don't run around murdering people on their own. They don't run around robbing people on their own. But they have been taught to believe that if you do certain pseudo-religious political rituals of elections and constitutions and legislation and all these official things in their big grandiose buildings, that what comes out the other side isn't bound by human morality. Like, they're allowed to steal, and because it's called taxation and it's the law, and people really and truly not only believe that that's somehow becomes justified, even though they know if they did it themselves, they'd recognize it as evil immediately. Not only do they think it somehow becomes good when it's done by way of legislation and all these rituals, but then they imagine any victims who resist it as being nasty and bad. So it really, their indoctrination into authoritarianism turns their perception of right and wrong completely upside down, completely inside out, so that literally they view good as bad and bad as good. And they will just vehemently cheer as quote-unquote criminals who haven't harmed anybody are crushed and thrown in a cage or shot or some other nasty thing. Because, yeah, even though in their day-to-day lives they pretty much get the basic morality of, you know, don't start a fight, don't be nasty to other people, when it comes to politics, they have totally been tricked into thinking that evil is good and good is evil, because by way of the political process, they think human morality, there's an exemption. You're allowed to steal if you do it this way. You're allowed to commit mass murder if you call it national defense and you do it this way. You're allowed to boss people around and violently intrude into their lives if you do it by way of legislation and democracy and all the fun rituals that go around the belief in statism. But the good news, I say, is that in their individual lives, most people already get all you need to get to coexist peacefully, which is don't steal from people and don't attack people and don't murder people. It's pretty dang simple. You know, there are always little gray areas that we can work out, but if we get that much, we're doing okay. But
it all really comes down to understanding the real difference between right and wrong, knowing what moral behavior really is, knowing what the transgressions against another's natural law rights really are, which is what you basically just stated. Don't kill, don't steal from people, don't take their property, don't trespass against their lair. Murder, rape, theft, trespass. These are the four basic natural law transgressions. And if we only really respected the self-ownership and the natural law rights of others, we wouldn't have to worry about creating these ridiculous authoritarian structures based on erroneous beliefs, because things would organically fall into place if we just respected that basic concept of self-ownership.
Right, and the reason I refer to the belief in authority as the most dangerous superstition is not only, like, people look to government to protect us from the imperfections of humanity. What they don't get is the only thing they're adding, the only thing that happens as a result of the state is more of those four bad things, because that's all the state ever does. It doesn't come along and make nice, helpful suggestions. It makes commands and it hurts those who disobey. And so the idea that you can make civilization by way of doing things that are exactly opposite to civilization is insane, but it's what we were all taught. It's what I was taught, and I believed it for years and years and years, that we need government, this giant, powerful, violent, control freak mechanism to make us good. And
you can't command moral behavior. Moral behavior cannot be commanded. It can only actually really be taught by those who have developed it themselves and then accepted by others who want to learn it. We'll pick this up on the other side. Don't go anywhere, folks. You're listening to Larken Rose right here on What on Earth is Happening. We'll be back after these words. Welcome back, everyone. You're listening to What on Earth is Happening here on Oracle Broadcasting. I'm your host, Mark Passio. My website, whatonearthishappening.com. We're talking today with Larken Rose of larkenrose.com. That's LARKENROSE.com. And Larken, I'd like to shift the focus of discussion a bit. We could return to some of the philosophy, but of course that'll be contained in what we talk about. I want to shift focus to some of the forms of media that you have put out there for people to take in that express these ideas. And let's start with some of your videos that you've put out there. One of my favorites was the video called "I'm Allowed to Rob You," which anyone can watch up on YouTube. And I'll also link these with the podcast for today's show when it goes up on the website as a podcast. There's also something out there called You're Not the Boss of Me, which I highly recommend for people to check out. And one of your more recent ones was called The Tiny Dot. So if you want to pick one of those and explain what your intentions were for those or what some of these videos contain, go right ahead.
Yeah, the first little YouTube thing I did was I'm Allowed to Rob You. And I thought I'll just make this short little silly thing. And basically, I did the equivalent of what the Constitution did, which is pretend to give someone the right to rob other people. It calls it taxation. It says Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, blah, blah, blah. So I basically just did a silly little video of me doing the same thing, but giving myself the right to rob you, the viewer. And it gets started out with just a scribbled version, and then it gets more and more complicated, more official looking, and just to sort of demonstrate how silly it is to think that any amount of scribbles on paper and rituals and declarations can actually make it okay for somebody to rob somebody else. And I found it was funny because I found that just a simple little video like that got a lot more attention than, when I write some big in-depth philosophical explanation of something, how many people are going to read that? But just that short little video got 60, 70,000 views by now, which is still sort of a drop in the bucket for the population, but that's pretty many people. Just sending it around because it just makes people go, yeah, that is sort of weird. Like, if I can just take little pieces of the belief in statism and just give a little taste of why it doesn't make sense. It doesn't explain everything. It explains almost nothing, in fact. But it just shows one little tidbit of why statism, which we were all raised in, is literally insane. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't match reality. The tiny dot was like that too. It just very simple animation showing the statistical difference between the number of people that claim the right to quote-unquote tax everyone in the country on what they earn, and the number of people who are handing over their money because this tiny little speck says you have to give us your money. And just showing the difference in size, it immediately jumps out at you, why the heck are these people going along with it? And why do they pathetically beg that stupid little dot you can hardly see to let them keep more of their money? And just to show things in these, just, again, little pieces of the puzzle that just make people scratch their heads and go, what? That's weird. Like the tiny dot has over 100,000 views now.
I love the idea in I'm Allowed to Rob You that it is actually the truth. It's not just an idea that a wrong cannot be transferred to another person and magically become a right. You can't give someone a non-existent right, that you don't have a right to do this to any other living being as an individual. So no amount of people coming together and claiming this right can ever make it moral. It's not a right, it's a wrong. You can't claim that you're allowed to commit a wrong, get a bunch of people to agree with you, sign it into something called legislation, and then magically automatically have inherently this ability to do something wrong that you wouldn't be able to do as an individual. I think this video makes that so clear in such a very concise way. That's what I found so powerful in watching it, and why I think more people should watch it to try to understand that particular point.
Yeah, and because it really comes down to just, the things that people instinctively know about right and wrong when it comes to their own life. They don't get that their whole belief in government turns it all upside down. Like they would never consider going to their neighbor's house and robbing them at gunpoint to help pay for their kids' education, but they wouldn't bat an eye before voting for somebody who's going to do the exact same thing. And yeah, the video demonstrates, because one of the versions of me trying to give myself the right to to rob the viewer is, well, I got some of my friends to sign this one, and they all said I have the right to rob you, as if, and anybody watching it immediately sees, well, that's silly. Your friends can't give you the right to rob me. But it's so obvious, it's so simple that it's almost stupid. But then you realize, well, wait, then how did the Constitution do it? How does democracy do it? How does government do it? None of it makes any sense.
It just shows you how much of a stranglehold this cult, and that's exactly what it is, has on the minds of people, and the things that they have gotten them to believe in that have absolutely no fundamental basis in reality or morality.
Right, and in so many of these instances, the truth is so painfully simple. And the lie is this huge, complex, convoluted, mental gymnastics trying to make the insane sound real. Like, well, they represent us, and like the end of the tiny dot gives his explanation of why this is okay, that there's this tiny little dot robbing all these people, and why they're obligated to do it. And the mythology we're taught, which I memorized and I spouted back and I got good grades, it's utterly insane. Okay, there's this group of people, they rob us, but they're representing us when they rob us and acting on our behalf, and so they somehow have our consent when they rob us. And all these things are blatantly, obviously untrue, but we were all taught to memorize and repeat them, because if you memorize and repeat something blatantly untrue enough times, you start to imagine that it makes sense. And the challenge here is just to get people to look at some really obvious, simple truths, like you can't delegate a right you don't have. It's just another way to say what you were just saying. And two people can't delegate a right that neither of them have. And just everybody instinctively knows that in their day-to-day lives. But then you say, okay, well then how did Congress get any right to do anything that I can't do myself? And then they go into their sort of mental retreat where they start to spout the bizarre, nonsensical excuses that they were taught growing up, why it's okay for that group to rob somebody else, and why it's not really robbery, and why it's really with our consent. Like, yeah, why do they have all the guns in prisons if it's with our consent? But they spout back the completely nonsensical garbage but you can see it. You can see that it hits them in the head, and they know, yeah, this doesn't make sense, and they freak out and go into literally psychological denial. They don't want to see something that simple that contradicts, a fundamental premise of the way they look at the world.
And so many people are willing to go along with this system to sit on a jury in judgment of other people who have actually committed no actual violent wrongdoing against another living being, and say that they are willing to agree to have them be put in a cage, taken away from their family. I mean, as a personal little anecdote here, a situation just came up within my family where my cousin's husband was just sent away to prison for an interaction between adults that involved substances, and he took a plea bargain so as to avoid a jury trial, which he thought would have gotten him more time, because people, would probably find him guilty based on man's law when no other living being was hurt by this voluntary exchange that took place.
Yeah, and their perception, the perception of the jurors and most observers, is completely twisted inside out. Because if you said, "Hey, here's my gun, guy over there, he's smoking pot. Go kick his door down, drag him away, and lock him in your basement for 10 years," they would say, "What? Are you crazy? I would never do that." Okay, well then why would you vote for somebody else to do the exact same thing? Why would you sit on a jury and say, "Yep, I approve of putting that guy in a cage for having a substance or something"?
Exactly. Larken, we're going to pick this up on the other side of the break. Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to What on Earth is Happening. My special guest today, Mr. Larken Rose. We'll be back where we'll talk about some of Larken's books that he has written. And we'll tell you how
the world's first and only Swiss Gold.
We're back, folks. You're listening to What on Earth is Happening. I'm your host, Mark Passio, and today my special guest is Larken Rose of LarkenRose.com. Before this last break, we were talking about the difference between man's law and moral law, how widely different the laws that people put into effect in society through legislation are than actual morality. Because for there to really be a crime committed, for there to really be a natural law transgression committed, there has to be a harmed individual. There has to be a harmed being. And so many offenses that people go away to prison for, and people are all too ready to put them there for doing, just because they believe in the claim of the state. They have actually harmed no one in doing that. They have not actually committed a transgression against someone else's natural law rights. So these are some of the things that Larken puts forward in some of his videos. So Larken, you want to pick it up from there?
Sure. Not only do people, they'll sit on a jury and say, hey, the law says you're not allowed to have that substance. They don't even know what they're saying. They literally don't know what they're saying when they say the law. If you ask them, well, what are you talking about? Where did it come from? Well, government. Okay, what the heck is government? Like, what's the origin of this scribble that you think makes it okay to put someone in a cage for having a substance or committing any other victimless, quote-unquote, crime? And eventually they realize, well, it's stuff politicians make up. But they don't talk like that. They talk as if it's, some holy thing descending from on high, the law. Like, who are you? And you can see it in terminology they use on a daily basis. They brag about being a law-abiding taxpayer, and they say, you think you're above the law? And I say, absolutely I'm above the law. Everybody's above the law. It's almost impossible to be below the law if by law you mean the politician scribbles. Because the politician scribbles legitimize way more violence and theft than the vast majority of things that they declare to be crimes. And so the sad part is when there's a jury that says, yeah, we'll say guilty because he got caught with pot, or he got caught, driving without a piece of paper that says he's allowed to, or whatever victimless, quote-unquote, crime, what they don't understand is they're the ones helping the crime. The real crime, when you're talking about natural law, you just put a guy in a cage. That's violence.
Exactly.
But they have their view is so backwards that, and I got a front row seat of this. I got 12 complete state-worshipping buffoons to say I should be in a cage for telling them that they were being defrauded by their own quote-unquote government.
What it really comes down to, Larken, is they're not even saying you're above the law as if they're trying to say to you, you think that you can do immoral things. They're saying, I, as a slave, am talking to the other slaves saying, how dare you think that you're not a slave? That's what they're really saying. They're saying you think you're above slavery, which is the arbitrary dictates of a psychopath telling other people how they should or should not behave if they're not hurting anybody else. So that's what that person is really saying. They're not openly saying it like you say. They dance around it. But what they're really saying to you is, I'm a happy little slave on the plantation, and I'm saying to another slave who doesn't want to be a slave, how dare you not want to be a slave?
Absolutely. That's absolutely exactly what it is. One of the things I read inside was the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, who was the open, obvious kind of slave that we all call slavery. And he described how a lot of the fellow slaves had that mentality. They believed they were supposed to be slaves, and they viewed a runaway slave as a thief for trying to steal himself from his master, and they would really view them with contempt.
Wow.
And that's exactly America today.
That's about as deep into the mindset of slavery as anybody could possibly get. That's amazing.
And it was really creepy to read, but then it dawned on me, well, of course, like, we would like to think of them as, the slaves as all thinking this is horrible and bad and wrong, and first chance I get, I'm going to run away. But if they thought that, they would have, because, they, even with all the quote-unquote law enforcers making slavery continue, they still outnumbered. They could still outrun them. The problem was they were enslaved inside their own heads just as much or more so than enslaved in body. And if you actually believe that you're supposed to be a slave, and you do if you take pride in being a law-abiding taxpayer, because what that means is I do what the politicians tell me and I give them my money. If you take pride in that, you are taking pride in being the property of politicians. And as long as you have that mentality, you're a slave forever. And you won't be able to understand why anybody else wouldn't be that. And you can see it. I saw it in my own jury. They couldn't fathom how another human being, never mind the legal reasons, would ever not want to pay homage to the master and say, yes, master, here's a bunch of what I earned, and, here's the fruits of my labor, here's a piece of my life. And they literally couldn't imagine how any human being who is good wouldn't bow the way they do. So they said guilty, and I got to be in a cage for a year.
Like you said, it's a complete twisting onto its head of true morality. True morality is actually standing up for your own rights and respecting the boundaries of other people's rights. And what they're saying is you're immoral if you don't want to have your rights transgressed upon by others.
Right. And in my case, what was really frustrating, and I admit I had a hard time not being bitter and angry about it, is what I did. I didn't get caught doing something. I set out to have the trial. I was there to tell those 12 people, you are being defrauded by your own government. And so I was there telling them, you're being victimized by an actual crime, like with a victim, you. And their response, because they've been so indoctrinated into authoritarianism, was, well, you're bad. You're bad for pointing out to us that somebody's robbing us, and for trying to not get robbed yourself. I mean, it's just like, again, in their daily lives, people aren't this insane. It's only when it comes to politics and government. Because if I came out and said, oh, somebody stole my car last week, nobody would think it would be rational for me to then go around to other people and say, I hate you, they didn't steal your car.
Exactly.
That's not a rational response. But that's what Americans think of, quote unquote.
Like he's not being beaten on as badly as I'm being beaten on, so I need to hate the person who's not being beaten on, not the person who's actually doing the oppression.
Exactly. Why don't you complain about the guy who stole your car instead of complaining about the guy who didn't get his car stolen? But with statist mentality, that's what it does. They literally, you look at what people think of tax evaders. Take a real case of tax evasion, which mine wasn't, where they just think, it's my money, I earned it. They didn't. I'm going to hide this over here and sort of lie about that, which is the exact same thing as how do I, I'm driving through a neighborhood, I know there are carjackers here, how do I outsmart them? There's nothing wrong with that. It's perfectly moral and virtuous, but most of the country does the equivalent of, how dare you do things to try to make the carjacker not steal your car? And they really think that is the sin. Tax evasion is the sin of trying to not get robbed. That's so bad that if you try to not get robbed, you should be put in a cage and then robbed.
It's the idea that you're not actually allowed to stand up for rights that you know that you inherently have. If you're not willing to abdicate your rights, that somehow makes you a bad or immoral person. Not the fact that standing up for and refusing to abdicate things that you know are inherent rights actually makes you a more virtuous human being.
Right. But you can see, because the belief in government is a religious belief, you can easily see that in most people's minds, right and wrong is outranked by the will of the politician. because what they wouldn't do in their personal lives, they will do in political, in the political realm.